Version 2 and version 3. Version 2 and version 3 revolve around riwayat or reports that are not found in the famous books of hadith. They're not found in the 6 books. They're not found in Musnad Imam Ahmad. They're not even found in Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham, which are the standard sources of tafsir. Rather, they are found in the more obscure works and the larger collections, the encyclopedias, the tertiary works. They're found usually in the books that collect everything, such as Tabari's tafsir. Tabari's tafsir, we need to understand one thing. Tabari did not intend to write a summarized tafsir for the masses. He wanted to write an encyclopedia for the scholars. And he collected everything that he found. And he mentions this in the beginning of his famous book. He says, I'm going to mention everything that I hear. I don't care if it's authentic or not. My job is just to report. So At-Tabari's reporting doesn't mean anything. He's just collecting. It's just like any unfiltered news source. It just narrates everything, right? At-Tabari is not Bukhari. Bukhari is a critical collector. Tabari is saying, I'm not a critical collector, I'm just collecting everything. And so these reports are found in Tabari in more obscure books that are not standard books, such as Al-Wahidis, Asbab al-Nuzul and others. And it mentions a story involving shaitan, involving Iblis. And because it involves Iblis, a Western researcher, one of the first researchers of this century to specialize in Islam, they were called Orientalists. His name is Sir William Muir. Sir William Muir, and he died 1905. He was the one who for the first time said, this is something, we'll call it the satanic verses. The name satanic verses is not found in the Quran and Sunnah. It's not found even in these weak narrations. It's found, or it's coined by a Western researcher, Sir William Muir. Sir William Muir is a Presbyterian minister who specialized in Islam, and he became one of the professors of Islam in Scotland, and he's a very famous Orientalist. This is 100 years ago. And he's written a very big book about the Seerah in English. And it was one of the first books of Seerah in the English language from a modern perspective, 100 years ago. And so he labeled the chapter, the Satanic Verses. So the term satanic verses comes from William Muir. The Islamic sources that do mention it, they call it Qissatul Gharaniq. And Gharaniq is the name of a bird. I tried to find out the equivalent. Modern Arab linguists have differed. What is the English equivalent of the bird? Is it the heron? Is it the pelican? Is it the crane? Some people have said it's a pelican. Some have said it is a crane. But it is a bird with a long neck. And some have said it is a heron, H-E-R-O-N. And others have said it is a pelican. But it is a bird with a long neck. So in Islamic sources, this is called the story of this bird. Qissatul Gharaniq. Why? We'll understand now. What is this story? So now let's talk about the two versions of the story. In essence, they're the same, but there's one crucial difference. And we'll explain this difference. So let's get on to version 2 of why the Abyssinian Muslims, why the Quraysh returned, or why the Muslims emigrated and then returned. Version 2. Remember, version 1 is Bukhari, right? That's clear cut. And it's definitely authentic. No question about that. Version 2 and 3 are adding details that are not found in Bukhari. So we need to now discuss them. What is version 2? Version 2 is reported by At-Tabari in his tafsir. And it goes back to Urwa ibn Zubayr, the famous tabi'i. He's not a sahabi. And this is the main weakness, that Urwa never saw the Prophet ﷺ, and Urwa is not narrating from the Prophet ﷺ, so there's a missing link, right? And this is one of the biggest weaknesses right now. Urwa ibn Zubayr said that when Surah An-Najm was being recited, now pay attention to this. In the first page of Surah An-Najm, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I'll give you the ayah number right now, ayah number 19 and 20. Najm 19 and 20. أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ اللَّاتَ وَالْعُزَّى وَمَنَاةَ الثَّالِثَةَ الْأُخْرَى. Have you not seen Allat and Al-Uzza and the third of them, Manat? Have you not seen Allat and Al-Uzza and the third of them, Manath? What are these three? These are the three? The three gods, the three idols, right? Now, in the Quran, verse 17, have you not seen, verse 19, have you not seen Allat and Al-Uzza? Verse 20, and Manat, the third of them. Verse 21, are you going to get the females and you will give him the males? Remember, the Arabs look down at women, right? So Allah is telling them, so you give him what you discard. You're going to kill girls, and yet you want your Lord to have daughters. تِلْكَ إِذًا قِسْمَةٌ ضِيزَى. What an unfair sharing. This is what the Quran says in front of us. Now, what is the story? You need to pay attention, a little bit of academic things here. So verse 19, verse 20. Have you seen Lat and Uzza and the third of them Manat? Urwa ibn Zubayr said, after verse number 20, Shaitan cried out. And he added 2 verses that were not in the Quran. And these verses were heard by the mushrikun but not by the Muslimun. Shaitan cried out in his own voice, in his own tongue, and he added 2 verses. Have you seen Lat and Al-Uzza and the third of them Manat? This is in the Quran. Then he added, تِلْكَ الْغَرَانِيقَ الْعُلَى وَإِنَّ شَفَاعَتَهُنَّ لَتُرْتَجَى. Gharaniq, this is where we get this from. These idols are the mighty pelicans or cranes. Gharaniq al-ula. These are the high and mighty pelicans, beautiful pelicans, right? وَإِنَّ شَفَاعَتَهُنَّ لَتُرْتَجَى. And their requests will be granted. Now this is the first time that the idols are being praised, apparently, right? The idols are being praised. That these idols are beautiful birds and their intercession will be accepted. You should worship them. And so, Urwa says, when the mushrikun heard these verses, they thought the Prophet Muhammad has compromised. Finally, he's come to a middle ground. He's willing to accept our gods. And did they have a problem accepting Allah? Did they have a problem? No. They had no problem accepting Allah, right? Because they believed in Allah. But their problem was you rejecting our gods, right? And so they said, according to this version 2, they said the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ has agreed to accept our gods. And so when he finished the surah and he prostrated, they basically said, we're all in agreement now, we don't mind worshipping along with you. Do you see version 2 now? Right? This is version 2. Now, why are the gods called Gharaniq? Gharaniq because some, again this is interpretation, is that just like the beautiful birds with long necks are going up to Allah, so these are idols that are going to take you up to Allah. This is how it is interpreted. So this is version number, what version are we talking about now? Version number 2. Version number 2. Now, version number 3. In yet other narrations, and these are found in Al-Wahidi and other sources. So we have to be very clear here, and our religion tells us to be academic. The satanic verses story is not concocted by non-Muslims. It's found in some of our sources. We have to be very clear here, right? And by the way, a lot of you are confused. Salman Rushdie's book, of course, it's named after this incident, but it's a whole work of fiction. But the point of the book is that, and this is why this is such a thing that the non-Muslims jump on. Apparently, the Prophet ﷺ could not tell the difference between Jibreel and Shaitan, or at least he's reciting verses. Now, from the perspective of non-Muslims, if this story is true, what would this mean? That the Quran is obviously being changed per whim. And one day, the Prophet ﷺ, I'm just saying what they say, so that we understand as Muslims, so don't quote me on this, astaghfirullah, this is kufr to say, right? I'm just saying what they say. So the Prophet ﷺ, a'udhu billah, I'm just saying what they say, tried to change his tactic and said, let's see if this is going to work. And he decided to change from tawheed to shirk. And so he said, khalas, let's worship all the gods together. But then there was a backlash from the Muslims. And so he said, oh no, these weren't verses that I said, these were verses Shaitan said. Hence, satanic verses. Right? So from the perspective of non-Muslims, this story clearly proves to them that the Prophet ﷺ is, a'udhu billah, inventing the Quran. That's what they say. Right? And so he's just changing his theology one day to the next, as any leader, as any politician does. He sings the tune of the people, right? One day he'll say this, one day he'll say that. So he's, according to them, changing his tune to get the people to come to him, right? And so this is why this story is a very important story that we talk about it academically. And I have to say clearly, this story is not fabricated by non-Muslims, it's found in our sources. right? And so they jump on it and they then make a very big deal out of it. And this is something that we need to discuss academically. So this is version number 2. Version number 3 is even worse than the second one. In version 2, Shaitan recites out and the people hear, correct? Version 3 is even worse. In version 3, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ hears Shaitan's recitation and thinks it is Jibreel reciting to him. And he then, in his own tongue, recites أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ اللَّاتَ وَالْعُزَّى وَمَنَاةَ الثَّالِثَةَ الْأُخْرَى تِلْكَ الْغَرَانِقَ الْعُلَى وَإِنَّ شَفَاعَتَهُنَّ لَتُرْتَجَى. Do you see the difference between 2 and 3 now? Right? And this is of course even worse because we are now saying, or those people who say this are saying that the Prophet couldn't tell the difference between Jibreel and Shaitan. And this is the premise of Salman Rushdie's book, that he begins the whole story with that. And it's a fictional book, but this is the premise. And he called the book Satanic Verses, and then that caused a whole furor. That's not relevant to our discussion. The book and what happened, that's a different discussion. We're interested in the actual story as found. Now, once again, we have to be academically true here. This is a version that is found in early Islamic Arabic sources. It's not something that I looked up myself to be on the 100% sure that this is not something they're inventing. It's something that is found. Some early books do mention it. So, we have now 3 versions of the story. The first version, Sahih al-Bukhari, and this is the version that is put in the 6 books and Musnad Imam Ahmad. In other words, from our perspective, basically the most authentic, the New York Times or whatever, the most authentic sources, they have this version. Then you get lower and lower in your authenticity, and then you have some details that are very strange. In version 2, the details say that Shaitan screamed out and the mushrikun heard and the Muslims didn't hear. Right? And so the Muslims didn't understand why the Quraysh prostrated. And they just thought that the power of the surah was that. In the third version, which is the most difficult for us to swallow, in the third version, Shaitan pretends to be basically who? Jibreel. And when Jibreel is reciting the Quran, Shaitan froze in 2 verses. And the Prophet ﷺ could not tell the difference. And so the Prophet ﷺ recited those 2 verses in the middle. And then when the Quraysh prostrated, according to these reports, Jibreel came back to him and said, "What did you recite?" And so the Prophet ﷺ recited with those 2 verses. And Jibreel said, "I never recited these 2 verses to you. I didn't come with these 2 verses." And the Prophet ﷺ became very depressed and very hurt that he thought that he was inventing this. And then Allah revealed, now this is another version of the surah, another version of the incident. Allah revealed Surah Hajj verse 52. Surah Hajj verse 52. Surah Hajj verse 52, what does it say? It's a very important verse, and according to this interpretation, it is linked to the satanic verses, story. Surah Hajj verse 52 says, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا مِن قَبْلِكَ مِن رَسُولٍ وَلَا نَبِيٍّ إِلَّا إِذَا تَمَنَّى أَلْقَى الشَّيْطَانُ فِي أُمْنِيَّتِهِ فَيَنْسَخُ اللَّهُ مَا يُلْقِي الشَّيْطَانُ ثُمَّ يُحْكِمُ اللَّهُ آيَاتِهِ وَاللَّهُ عَلِيمٌ حَكِيمٌ. That never did we send before you a prophet or a messenger, except that when he إِذَا تَمَنَّى, when he, now here's what does tamanna mean? For now, let us just say it means to recite, even though there's another interpretation. One interpretation says, when he recites, أَلْقَى الشَّيْطَانُ فِي أُمْنِيَّتِهِ, Shaitan adds something to his recitation. And then Allah abrogates the shaitanic recitation, and Allah affirms His own ayat. ثُمَّ يُحْكِمُ اللَّهُ آيَاتِهِ. For indeed Allah is all knowledgeable and Allah is all wise, so that the one that Shaitan said, or the thing that Shaitan said, will become a fitna for those who have a weak heart, and for those who have a disease in their hearts, and for those who have a hard heart. قَاسِيَةِ قُلُوبُهُمْ. Right? So Shaitanic revelations or Shaitanic verses will become a fitna, a test for those who have a disease in their hearts. Now, that's in Surah Al-Hajj. It's in there. So, according to this version, Shaitan actually succeeds in deceiving the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam recites satanic verses, and Allah then corrects the satanic verses, and the proper recitation is revealed, and therefore the Quraysh who initially said, okay, let's all join hands, they say, no, we're not going to join hands. And so this reaches the Muslims of Abyssinia, and then they return. Now, let us spend a little bit of time, academic study. Let's look at these three reports. There is no question that the first report is authentic. It is in Bukhari. The issue comes, of course, those who follow the second or third opinion don't find a contradiction in Bukhari, and this because the gist of the story, Bukhari has an outline. He recited Surah An-Najm, everybody prostrated. Version 2 and 3 can accept this outline, correct? Right? So Bukhari's version doesn't contradict version 2 and 3. Therefore, this is the problem. We don't need 2 and 3, but Bukhari's version doesn't contradict. So those who accept 2 and those who accept 3, they accept Bukhari as well. And they say, khalas, Bukhari is also authentic. Now, what do we do with all of these? The first thing we do as lay people, let us see what the scholars say. Sadly, the scholars did not all agree. Usually scholars agree about many things, but sometimes they don't all agree, and that's why it becomes a little bit more difficult, right? So we have, for example, a good group of scholars who rejected version 2 and 3 and they stuck with version 1. Alhamdulillah. And these were big names. People like Ibn Kathir, the most famous scholar of tafsir, right? People like Al-Qadhi Iyad, who is a specialist in Seerah. People like Fakhruddin al-Razi, people in our times like Shaykh al-Albani, who's one of the greatest scholars of hadith of our times. He passed away 9 years ago, 10 years ago actually, subhanAllah, time flies. Shaykh al-Albani passed away, but he was the greatest scholar of hadith alive in our times. He wrote an entire booklet about this story, just this story, he wrote a booklet on it. And he went over every single report, wherever it's found. And he shows in academic detail that everyone is weak. Everyone is weak. And so we have a lot of very famous people saying versions 2 and 3, we cross them out. Version 1 is enough. One of the famous scholars of the past, Muhammad ibn Ishaq ibn Khuzaymah. Ibn Khuzaymah is a great scholar of hadith. He died 311 Hijrah, and he was one of the few people who wrote a Sahih book. There's 4 people who wrote Sahih books. A little bit of a tangent here. Bukhari, Muslim, Ibn Hibban, Ibn Khuzaymah. 4 people wrote Sahih books. Ibn Khuzaymah is one of them. And so Ibn Khuzaymah is one of these great scholars of hadith. He was asked about this story, the story of Shaitan inspiring the Prophet. He said, this is a fabrication that the enemies of Islam did to try to destroy Islam. This is going back 311 Hijrah. From the very beginning, some people are saying this is a fabrication that the enemies of Islam have done to try to destroy it. Okay, so this is one group of scholars. How I wish that we could have restricted ourselves to them. Unfortunately, there are scholars who do follow the other versions of the story as well. And they are big names. And because of this, we have to be academically fair. Our religion tells us to not hide the truth. Our religion tells us to be frank and honest. Our religion tells us to be academically inclined. So we need to talk about this academically. By the way, interesting point here. In 1966, there was an entire worldwide conference in Cairo over this story. The whole conference was over this story, to discuss it academically and to find out. And all the people presented papers and they talked about, discussed it 40 years ago. And a lot of major scholars were present there. And the conclusion of the conference was that the story is fabricated. The story is not true. So we can say that the bulk of the scholars of our times want to cross out number 2 and 3. And they say there's no need for it. And this is true to say this. And if you read almost any modern book of Seerah, from Shaykh Safir Rahman Mubarak Furi to any of the famous books, you will find that this story is either not mentioned or it will mention it as a fabrication. Okay. As we said, academically speaking, we have to be honest here. We have to say, well, that's not the only position even within Sunni Islam. Some scholars have accepted version 2 and some scholars have even accepted version 3. And had they been small names, we could have ignored them, but they're all big names.